Alright, Year 12, so today we're going to look at Lecture 7, which I'm calling the Stamp Act Crisis. And as you can see on the right of your screen, compared to the last lecture where I portrayed or showed you an image of a stamp, a royal stamp, this time we've got a piece of propaganda called an emblem of the effects of the stamp with a skull and crossbones. So you could probably assume what is going to happen in this lecture. Alright, just very quickly, last time we looked at the Stamp Act of 1765, along with a lot of other acts, but we focused mainly on the Stamp Act. And we noticed a lot of different consequences of the Stamp Act, but I brought up these two, specifically called the Sons and Daughters of Liberty and the phrase no taxation without representation. And they're our key focuses of today. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty are two key knowledge areas that you need to be aware of. And also the phrase no taxation without representation is another key knowledge area that you must be aware of for the SAC and for the end of year exam. So please make sure you're taking very careful notes today. All right, our learning intentions for today is to be able to describe the Stamp Act crisis by using the term no taxation without representation and explain the role of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. So pretty much I want you to be able to take away an understanding of what no taxation without representation was and who the Sons and Daughters of Liberty were. If you're following the textbook, it's pages 75 to 83. Now, in comparison to previous lectures, I'm pretty much just going to give you a straight narrative this lecture and then summarize it using the cause and consequence structure that I've been using for the other lectures. But I thought it was probably best if we just follow the narrative for the crisis instead of looking at each individual cause and consequence and trigger. All right, so the Stamp Act narrative, pretty much, just to reiterate, to fix the economic stress on Britain following the French and Indian War, British Prime Minister George Grenville was commissioned by King George III to fix the economic crisis. And so George Grenville, the Prime Minister, came up with 4 acts, one of them called the Stamp Act, a tax on paper products that is only for the colonies and not the Britons. Now, that is a significant piece of information that we have to take away from this. The fact that the Stamp Act that George Grenville introduced to the House of Commons, that the House of Commons passed, was only for the colonies and was not for the Britons. So all the extra money that was being paid for paper products, that was only if you're an American. It wasn't if you're a Briton. Now, in response to this, merchants and traders from Massachusetts formed a group called the Sons of Liberty in May 1765, stating that there should be no taxation without representation. Pretty much the idea of no taxation without representation comes back to what George Grenville was saying up here. So George Grenville approaches the House of Commons, which is our parliament, okay, and he says to the House, I'm going to introduce a Stamp Act that is going to tax the Americans. And in the House of Commons, there is no American representative. So there was no opportunity for the Americans to actually stand up for their own rights and say, no, you can't do this. This is going against possibly our own British rights. And that's where the idea of no taxation without representation comes in from the Sons of Liberty. The idea that no one should be taxed without having a say on the tax itself. This idea of no taxation without representation travels to Virginia, from Massachusetts to Virginia, and Patrick Henry, who is a key figure that you need to be aware of. Patrick Henry, a lawyer in the Virginia House of Burgesses, challenges the Stamp Act through what's called the Virginia Resolves, alongside many other people in the Virginia House of Burgesses. But this process called the Virginia Resolves, Patrick Henry becomes known for. So the Virginia Resolves humbly, and underline the word humbly, the Virginia Resolves humbly petitions King George III to rethink the Stamp Act. And they have 4 specific reasons for this. Number 1, colonists came to Virginia with the same equal rights as all British subjects. Number 2, colonial charters confirmed that the Virginians came with the same equal rights as all British subjects. The Virginians, number 3, had the right to govern themselves, i.e. salutary neglect, kind of popping up again. And number 4, the Virginian colonial legislature did not forfeit its right to oppose taxes. Now, these 4 statements were written up as the Virginia Resolves, and they were sent to King George III humbly. Okay, I'll back. They weren't sent to King George III. They were approved by the House of Burgesses first. Now, the House of Burgesses, the Resolves, actually, before even making it to King George III, they actually made it to the other colonies. The news travelled fast, firstly to Rhode Island, and then from Rhode Island to Massachusetts, where the Sons of Liberty were. Massachusetts then rallies a lot of the other colonies together and again humbly petitions the king for the same reason. And that introduces the Stamp Act Congress in October 1765, where all the colonies gather except for New Hampshire, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. So just to kind of recap on this slide, the Virginia Resolves is pretty much reminding King George in a very humble way that, the Virginians, i.e. the Americans, all have the same rights as the British subjects. And when the king originally sent the Americans to America, or the colonists to America, the charters that were drafted confirmed that everyone in America has the same rights as everyone in Britain. But that isn't what's being communicated at the moment through this Stamp Act, through what George Grenville is doing. George Grenville isn't giving the Americans an opportunity to stand up for themselves. He's not giving them the natural right of life and liberty, especially liberty and property. And so the Virginia Resolves is pretty much just bringing this idea of natural rights back to the forefront. But what it's also doing, and what we find out through the Stamp Act Congress, is that it's allowing the colonies to actually join together for the very first time to assess and challenge the British Constitution and the British legislation and the British Empire. It's the very first act of the colonies to actually turn around as one united party, aside from those 4 colonies that didn't join, to actually challenge the king over the British Constitution. And so what ends up happening is a drafting of the Declaration of Rights and Grievances by the Stamp Act Congress that pledged affection to the King George, but argued that he had usurped natural rights. And that should start ringing alarm bells for the idea of republicanism. This is what republicanism is encouraging, the idea that we pledge our loyalty to King George insofar as he makes sure that he's not going to become a tyrant and we retain our natural rights. But as soon as the king becomes a tyrant, as soon as the tyrant takes away our natural rights, the next best person has to then overthrow the king. And that's what this is pretty much doing. The Stamp Act Congress is saying it's a Republican movement, really, that is challenging the king to just check himself before he actually goes ahead with this Stamp Act. Now, in the meantime of the Virginia House of Burgesses and the Stamp Act Congress join together and humbly, and I'll say it again, humbly petitioning the king, in the meantime, we've got the Sons of Liberty, who in Massachusetts are running amok. Between the publishing of the Virginia Resolves and the gathering of the Stamp Act Congress, the Sons of Liberty, an organized group of angry merchants and traders, have done the following. They've built an effigy of Andrew Oliver, who was a Stamp Act agent, and stamped on it on 14th of August 1765. So Andrew Oliver is someone who's been commissioned by the British government to actually enforce the Stamp Act. Every time a merchant would require paper, they would go to Andrew Oliver to get it stamped. So it's officially stamped. They would pay the tax to Andrew Oliver, and then they would then be able to pass on their paper goods, and Andrew Oliver would pass the tax back to Britain. Obviously, with what's going on at the moment, okay, the Americans don't like the Stamp Act, and especially the Sons of Liberty, who are a group of angry merchants and traders who potentially go out of business because of the Stamp Act. They really hate Andrew Oliver. Well, they really hate the empire more. But Andrew Oliver becomes kind of the embodiment of the empire, and so they build an effigy and they literally stamp on the effigy. Secondly, shortly after that, they go and destroy Thomas Hutchinson's house. Thomas Hutchinson is the governor of Boston. He's a loyalist, so he's loyal to the crown. He does what the empire wants. He's also in favor of the Stamp Act, and so the Sons of Liberty turn on him too, and they destroy his house. Windows, doors, roof, trees, tables, paintings, everything gone. And they do that shortly after the effigy of Andrew Oliver on the 26th of August 1765. The Sons of Liberty also encouraged the boycotting of stamps and British goods, and that is specifically when the Daughters of Liberty come into play. So it's just the women's equivalent of the Sons of Liberty. And the Daughters of Liberty stop drinking tea that is shipped over from Britain, and they start making their own clothes and start producing their own goods, their own American created goods. So whilst the Stamp Act is actually trying to encourage the British economy by taking in this new tax, the British once again find that no matter how hard they try, the Americans somehow stop what they're trying to achieve, because in this case, the Daughters of Liberty stop buying products made in Britain. So all the money, all the revenue that Britain would have gained by the Daughters of Liberty buying those products, they've now lost that. So that's what the Daughters of Liberty movement becomes, and we slowly see that the Daughters of Liberty become more domesticated. They become less reliable on American goods, and before we know it, we realize that we've got colonists that are less and less dependent on Britain. They are domesticated, and they know how to use their land for their advantage. The fourth thing that the Sons of Liberty do, they've started similar movements in New York, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. So right down the eastern seaboard, we see the specific groups of the Sons of Liberty popping up all over the place, which again is another way of, unlike the Stamp Act Congress, which is uniting the colonies in peaceful negotiation with the empire, the Sons of Liberty are uniting the colonies again, but in full-blown rebellion, as we see from the example of Thomas Hutchinson's house. And consequently of this movement, 14 stamp agents across the eastern seaboard, so pretty much in all the colonies, they all resign. These guys, they've seen what happens to Andrew Oliver, they've seen what happens to Thomas Hutchinson, and they pretty much say, this isn't worth it. We could get killed because these Americans, these Sons of Liberty, really hate what the empire's done to them. And so they resign and they go do something else. So all of a sudden we see the Stamp Act not even be able to be actually put into action because there's no one on or in America making it happen except for the governors who are acting on behalf of Britain. But even still, even if you're a governor, you're not protected, as Thomas Hutchinson has witnessed. And so pretty much the cause of the Stamp Act crisis that occurs after the Stamp Act being brought up is pretty much the idea of no taxation without representation. Both parties, the Sons of Liberty and the Virginia Resolves / the Stamp Act Congress, they're both acting out of this idea that there should be no taxation without representation. Their way of going about actually approaching the crown is very different, obviously. the Stamp Act Congress / Virginia Resolves is very moderate and very civilized, whereas the Sons of Liberty and Daughters of Liberty, but specifically the Sons of Liberty, they are a lot more forthright and aggressive towards the king. And so, obviously the Sons of Liberty get the attention of the king more so than the Stamp Act Congress. But what we eventually see is the Stamp Act being repealed, being stopped by the king, and we get the introduction of what's called the Declaratory Act. Also, Prime Minister Grenville gets replaced by Lord Rockingham, and these two dot points down the bottom we're going to look at closer next lesson. But for right now, the short-term consequences of the Stamp Act is Britain losing control of the colonists, as seen in the formation of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, and the colonists uniting against the Empire when assessing their British rights. And they're kind of the two key consequences. The cause, no taxation without representation. The consequences, those two, again, I'll say in two different ways. One very civilized and one very aggressive. Okay, next time we're going to look at how King George responds to the Stamp Act crisis. And we're going to look at specifically the Declaratory Act and the Townshend Act. If you've got any questions, email me, Google Classroom, bring in the classroom, in person, whatever you want. Okay, see you later.